Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible until it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here are your hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back to the 36th episode of Press the Button. I'm Michelle Dover, Director of Programs.
And I'm Joe Cirincione, President of Plowshares Fund, and we have a special episode for you today.
Very, very special. But first, you're covering the news.
I am. We're going to focus this week on the failure of the House Democrats to use their leverage in passing the $738 billion National Defense Authorization Act to extract policy concessions from Trump. And we're going to cover this with two advocates who were pounding the halls of Congress all year on this bill, Geoffrey Wilson from the Council for Liberal World and Erica Fein from Win Without War.
We will not have a Q&A this episode, but we do want you to know that we have launched an official Twitter account for the podcast at PressButtonPod, and we are now using this to solicit more questions. So please give us a follow, and if you have a question, just tweet or DM us. Remember, it's at PressButtonPod.
All of that is very special, but the big news is that we wanted to give you an extraordinary interview for the holiday season. We have with us today, drum roll please, Madeleine Albright. Yes, the Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright was the first woman to become Secretary of State. She served under Bill Clinton from 1997 to 2001. Before that, she was the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations from 93 to 97. She's been in a host of key national security roles throughout her stellar career. She's currently the chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group. She's a professor at Georgetown University, where I first met her in the early 80s. She was a professor. I was a student, and her latest book is Fascism, A Warning. We're going to talk about a special meeting that she just chaired in Vienna. I was fortunate to attend. It was a meeting of former foreign ministers, the ex-min, as they're sometimes called, but you'll hear it first and fully from her directly in just a minute.
But as always, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share if you like what you hear. Your feedback is what makes this show keep going.
We have a lot to cover, and the clock is ticking. Let's go.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
I'm Joe Cirincione, and I'm hosting Early Warning today. Your usual host, Michelle Dover, is at a conference in London this week. But I'm here with Erica Fein from Win Without War and Geoffrey Wilson from the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. We're going to go through the National Defense Authorization Act, what just happened with that bill, talk about the Afghan papers, what it means for how America wages war, and whether we can ever stop waging war, and a couple of other topics, all in 7 minutes. Erica, please get us started. We just passed the National Defense Authorization Act in the House of Representatives, $738 billion, the largest America has ever given the Pentagon in any 1 year since World War II, with the exception of the first 2 years of the Iraq War. A lot of the language that the House adopted that made it what some call the most progressive Defense Authorization Act in history, although I personally think the stuff we did in 84, 85, 86 is a contender for the title. But a very progressive bill coming out of the House. All those provisions got dropped in conference with the Senate. Can you walk us through some of the policy issues that the House passed that died in conference?
Yes, absolutely. The House over the summer did pass a bill that was $733 billion in authorization for the Pentagon. But what it also did was it constrained the president on a number of issues, including on a march to war with Iran. It would cut off funds for any unauthorized war. It ended U.S. support for the Saudi and Emirati-led intervention in Yemen, the world's worst humanitarian crisis. It also cut off arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. It overturned the discriminatory ban on transgender service members. It also regulated the toxic chemical that's contaminating military bases called PFAS as part of a broader U.S. environmental regulation. So it did a lot.
Did a lot. And Geoffrey, what were some of the weapons provisions that got dropped?
Sure. Certainly the biggest one is that it stripped an amendment out of the House version of this bill that had prohibited the deployment of a new low-yield nuclear weapon from the submarine missile force. This is also coming at the same time that this president is being run on charges for high crimes and misdemeanors, and people say that this is a new, more usable nuclear weapon.
And this will be deployed when?
In the coming year.
So Trump will have this weapon at his disposal.
So we are providing $10 million for the deployment of this weapon onto submarines over the next year.
Great, just great. Go ahead, what else?
On top of that, we are the House had originally asked to cut money out of ground-based missile defense.
These are the interceptors in Alaska and California.
Alaska and California.
44 interceptors, yeah.
Yeah, soon to be 64 that have proven to be ineffective in over 50% of scripted tests. We're actually giving about $37 million more than requested to that program. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, we're also establishing a new branch of the armed services. I'm sure you'll be happy to know, Joe, a Space Force underneath the Department of the Air Force. And then on top of that, the bill also stripped out language that would prevent the Pentagon personnel from spending any money at Trump hotels internationally. So the troops can still stop over in Scotland and play a couple rounds of golf.
Have a couple of pints. Yeah, very nice. Very nice. Very good. So tell me, what happened here? There was so much enthusiasm for this bill coming out when it was voted in July 12th, I think. No Republicans voted for it. Progressive Democrats who had never voted for the defense authorization voted for it because of this language. What happened?
Yeah, I think that the forces were really stacked against this year. Even though we had this incredible victory in the House in the summer, we shouldn't forget that the Senate bill was very, very pro forma, as it were. It didn't include any of these provisions. There was a vote on constraining Trump's ability to go to war with Iran. It had bipartisan majority support, but it didn't pass because it didn't have 60 votes. So
why? What explains our failure here?
It's really, we're up against the behemoth defense industry. We're up against years of tradition in terms of getting this bill done year after year for over 50 years.
Right. When you want to cut arms to Yemen, Raytheon is going to get hit.
Right.
So Raytheon is an example. Contractors
Exactly.
swarming over the hill, insisting that this bill must be passed and these provisions must be dropped.
At the same time, Democrats are trying to impeach the president right now, and they want to show that they can walk and chew bubblegum, that they can also still govern, right? This is the classic problem with Democrats, of people have sometimes said they want to show that they can do it both, and they're the party that wants to show that they can govern, and they make compromises.
So passing this bill demonstrates governance.
Yeah.
Is there any positive way to look at this? We got clobbered. All of our priorities, things we've been talking about all year, wiped off the mat. Is there something good that came out of this fight?
Yeah, I think that what we saw this year, unlike in previous years, is we saw a movement that was willing to fight against this behemoth, that was really ready to expose the waste and militarism that goes into this bill year after year. And we did in the House pass all of these provisions that helped put the narrative into the media that, the country wants to end the war in Yemen. It wants to stop a war with Iran. It wants to, prevent the deployment of a low-yield nuclear weapon. And so while we didn't ultimately prevail, we got the message out there that these are the things that we're going to stand up for.
You're going to be fighting next year for similar provisions?
Yes.
Geoffrey?
Absolutely.
Okay, back into the trenches. Meanwhile, the Washington Post has a blockbuster expose of the failed war in Afghanistan. We don't have time to do this justice, but very quickly, what are your takeaways from reading those stories?
Sure. We're about to spend, like Joe said, more money, authorize more money on defense than we have since World War II. This is coming at the same moment where investigative journalism in this country is revealing that either because they were unwilling or unable to, the United States government has failed to exercise oversight in the longest war in American history. That we're about to spend $738 billion on defense when the government officials have been lying to Americans about the effectiveness overseas.
Before the sirens cut us off, Erica.
Yeah, we've known for a long time that the war has been a failure. It has long since time to bring our troops home. This is just yet another reminder of that. At the same time, we need to be investing in things like peace building and diplomacy, and not forget about the country, because obviously we've done tremendous amount of damage to it over the past 18 years.
Support our troops. Bring them home. Thank you very much. The sirens are wailing. Erica, Geoffrey, it was too short, but very, very helpful.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'm Joe Cirincione, and I'm here in the offices of Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who in 1997 became the 64th and first woman Secretary of State, and at that time the highest-ranking woman in the history of the United States government. Secretary Albright, thank you very much for letting us come to your offices and talk with you.
Well, I'm delighted. Very glad to have this discussion with you.
And one of the great pleasures of my life is to count you as one of my mentors. And I want to thank you for all the guidance and wisdom you've given me over the years.
Well, thank you, and I love talking about you as my student.
It's one of my honors. I should list it in my resume.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. But we're here to talk about a very interesting meeting that you had in Vienna just a few weeks ago, and you were gracious enough to invite me to attend. And at that meeting, we discussed the global threats we were facing, particularly the threats of nuclear weapons use, possession, and cyber threats, and how these were interacting to create a new, dangerous 21st century battlefield. Can you tell us a little bit about the group and how you got this started?
Yes, thank you. I mean, let me just say, I invented something really new when I was Secretary of State, which was the International Telephone Conference Call. And so during the war in Kosovo, I spoke to the Quint, the British, French, Germans, Italians, and us every day on an open line about the war. And then we branched out and talked to some of the other ministers. And so what happened in 2002, end of 1 and 2, was that all of a sudden I started getting calls from the former foreign ministers saying, people are saying terrible things about the U.S., do something. So I decided to create a group of former foreign ministers, and its official name is the Aspen Ministers Forum because it's under the auspices of the Aspen Strategy Group. Its unofficial name is Madeleine and her exes. So we have now been meeting for about 25 years.
I laugh every time I hear that.
But it's a wonderful group because I have added to it, but mostly we are very good friends. We speak without our national positions. We trust each other, and we really kind of push ourselves and each other to think forward. And so it's one of the favorite things that I do. And as you mentioned, we did just meet in Vienna. We've had a kind of a series of meetings looking at what is going on nationally and internationally. We had a meeting on nationalism at Versailles. Mm-hmm. We went to the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri to talk about commemorating the founding of NATO, and that's also where I signed the accession papers for the Czechs, the Poles, and the Hungarians on a table of Harry Truman's. So we were able to talk about that. And then in Vienna, as I said and you said, we branched even or ranged further in terms of looking at what's happened to the various arms control agreements and new technology. So It was great.
It was great. It was a wonderful meeting, very densely packed, but very disturbing and a little grim in the topics we were discussing. What were your takeaways from the meeting?
Similar to yours, frankly. And I think that one of the things we do, we bring in experts, and you were one of them, to kind of have discussions from an expert point of view, what people see. And I think that what we are seeing is just generally kind of disquiet around the world about rules that have guided us in a whole series of areas, but we focused primarily on nuclear weapons and the whole arms control picture in Vienna, which I think of the various things that are going on in the world speaks more than anything to what happens when countries don't negotiate, when they don't talk to each other, when they don't try to stay up on what are the issues at hand, and, if I may say so, when the U.S. is not in the lead.
In fact, it's in the lead of taking down the regime, which is one of the issues we talked about. Would you say it's fair to say that the group felt that we were in a period where these institutions built over the last decades are now collapsing, not because they're not working, but because people are physically working to take them down, dismantle the arms control architecture?
I think that was definitely what came out. And in other meetings, that's been true. We also, at a certain stage, were in Morocco and Marrakesh, and there was an immigration conference going on at the time, and the U.S. was AWOL. So there are any number of things where we have taken the lead, where all of a sudden we're either not there at all or are being negative about what is going on. I think people are very troubled by that particular thing. In addition, that I think no matter what the position of the United States might be, that in fact there are new threats that require very patient and informed decision-making, like all the aspects about cyber, artificial intelligence. So we're in a new world without a leader.
Right, and the intersection of AI and cyber and nuclear is particularly terrifying.
Exactly.
And as far as you can see, there's no attempt to control, regulate these new technologies?
Well, from what I know, since I'm not in the inside, but I think there's more of a sense, frankly, that the U.S. should not be involved in any of this, that all of a sudden the U.S. is the victim or is paying for it or is not germane to our needs. I find it a combination of ignorance and a lack of understanding of how we need to be leaders.
And when you get the chance to get together with your former leaders, the former ministers, was there any shared sense of the state of the Western alliance?
They were very concerned about the Western alliance, especially since, as I mentioned, we got started during Kosovo.
Yes.
And it was the first time really in the Balkans that NATO went to war. And it was having dealt with the NAC and a variety of ways of making decisions in NATO. I think that that's how we started our friendship. I then got involved at the 60th anniversary of NATO at looking at a new strategic concept of NATO. So there have been attempts to modernize the alliances, but I think there was kind of a sense that the U.S. just wanted to be paid, or that the budget aspect of it was important, or there were really questions that dovetailed with the kind of things that we're all reading in the newspapers, which is, who are we?
Yeah, I was struck by the ease with you and your colleagues discussed a lot of these complicated issues and the friendships and trust that you all had in each other. And this was occurring at the same time as the 70th NATO anniversary meeting was happening, which was the polar opposite: discord, dissension, awkwardness around the President of the United States, who left early from that. No leadership, everybody joking about the leadership of the President of the United States. What happened?
I think that I try to be fair about this. I think that what has happened is the world has gotten more complicated because throughout there are various, I've sometimes talked about it as the mega trends and their downside. So clearly globalization has been positive for an awful lot of people, especially the kind that we know and can benefit from it. But it does have a downside. It's faceless. And people want to know who they are. And I think we're all entitled to know what our identity is, linguistic, religious, ethnic, etc. But if my identity hates your identity, then it becomes nationalism, and hyper-nationalism is very dangerous. And we're seeing that happen in a number of places, especially actually in Europe, with some of the things in Central and Eastern Europe that have been going on. The other mega trend is technology, which has done incredible things in terms of bringing people together. And I always like to talk about the Kenyan woman farmer that no longer has to walk tons of miles to pay her bills. She can do it over a mobile phone, and she can have a whole new life and start a business or get a more education or spend time with her family. So that's been very positive. The negative part is that it disaggregates voices, and people get their information through social media or some echo chamber, and so it's very hard to be politically organized. And so then I think the largest issue is that in many ways the social contract has been broken. People don't know what the government is doing for them, and the government doesn't know to what extent the people support their decisions.
We saw both of these trends, I think, in the recent UK election. Are these some of the factors you think affected that election, Boris Johnson's victory?
I do think so. I think that, first of all, I think we all, and I really, that should be in capitals and underline, didn't fully understand what technology does to societies in terms of jobs being lost and developing a different kind of elite that comes with that and exacerbating the divisions. And then I think, I always think this is artificial, but really kind of hyping the fact that there are immigrants coming into countries. And it was the Polish plumber in England.
Yes.
And I think they're going to miss the Polish plumber or the various people that have come. But I think it is certainly something that has affected many countries. And it goes back to that hyper-nationalism. Why should we have people that look and act differently from us?
Which is now affecting our country, wouldn't you say?
Very much so.
Yeah.
I find it, as an immigrant myself, find it very hard to believe the kind of policies that have been undertaken at the southern border, particularly separating families and saying that people that are coming into this country are terrorists or drug dealers, rapists, and also initially very much directed at people from Muslim countries, thereby exacerbating the divisions in religion and ethnic basis in a way that's very damaging. I think the whole part is that I don't think anybody has in the government, and this isn't just in the Trump government, but I think basically haven't thought about the unintended consequences of decisions.
Of decisions like?
Well, I think, for instance, I think those in terms of how we reacted to what was happening in Georgia or how we reacted to what was happening in Ukraine when the Russians went in just with little green men took Crimea. And then a sense of not understanding trade agreements and a variety of things. The world has changed. I really do think that the 21st century is different from the 20th. And I think that we didn't kind of assess it enough, just kind of thought we'd move from one to the other.
Right. So we thought there was going to be a steady state of progress. Yeah. We were reducing nuclear arms. This would always continue. We'd always reduce nuclear arms. We were getting closer in our Western alliance, our economies. This would always happen. We get closer. And those clearly the last 3, 4, 5 years have shown that's not true. And this is what struck me about the Vienna Forum. We were discussing the intersection of these global trends and the national dislocations it's causing and these weapons of mass destruction. This is all happening when a few men, they're all men, in 9 different nuclear armed states have the ability to destroy the world at the push of a button. Bringing you back to that issue just for a second, do you have any recommendations or are you working on recommendations for the next president of the United States if Donald Trump should lose and a Democrat be elected? Where do you think this set of issues should be on his or her agenda?
I would hope that we would elect somebody that understood that our national security depends on what is happening in other countries and not to build moats or walls or things. Instead, we should build bridges and understand that our national security depends on what's happening in other countries, which does cover our economic relations, our political relations, and our military relations. And I think and I do believe in American leadership. By the way, President Clinton is the first one that started talking about us as an indispensable nation. I just said it so often it became identified with me. But there's nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. It just means we need to be engaged. And I think actually it's the partnerships that we develop through that makes the world work. Currently, this administration has made multilateralism sound like a four-letter word, and it is just a matter of partnership. And so I do think that one has to look at what can be and by the way, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to understand that the kinds of things such as climate change or global poverty or arms control cannot be done by one country alone. It just is part of the way that it has to operate. And I think that's what needs to happen, is kind of to look at where we are, what are the issues that are out there threatening, what are the ones that we benefit from. And so I think there's going to be a lot of work.
Let me ask you about one in particular, and I'd be derelict if I let you go without talking about your visit to North Korea, which was 1999. At the very end, 2000, right at the very end of the Clinton administration, we seem to be very close to a deal at that point. Can you tell us a little bit about that trip, what you would hope to accomplish, what went wrong, and if you have any advice for the Trump administration now? Shortly after we broadcast this interview, Kim Jong-un has threatened to deliver a Christmas present to the United States if we haven't reversed course and started negotiation the way he'd like. Can you tell us a little about where you were at this moment in time? I guess that would be 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I think just flat out one has to say that the North Koreans are not easy to deal with. Right. They have no sense of time. Throughout the Clinton administration, there were some issues that came up about North Korea. Whether they were living up to their requirements under the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Right, and the agreed framework.
All kinds of aspects. And they would wait till the last minute or they would renege on something. So I do think that one has to see that. I met with Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, and we had very little information on him. But what was interesting when I got there, we had some very serious discussions, and those were mostly about ballistic missile limits. That was part of the issue that we were dealing with, and I thought he was actually very smart and knowledgeable on a variety of issues, and I think also that we were getting somewhere, and the timing was kind of difficult because, as most people remember, the election of November 2000, and a delay in a number of different aspects. We were about to begin, and this is a very important part, just to interject. It is nice when you're either Secretary of State or the President to be able to go in and negotiate, but the bottom line is you need a lot of experts to carry out what the details of these things are. So
experts, novel idea.
So the thing that was, we were getting ready to start a series of talks in Kuala Lumpur. And I think people now know who Wendy Sherman is, and Wendy was part of this. And we were together on a trip in Africa during the transition, and all of a sudden, and she was all packed, ready to go to Kuala Lumpur if we ever really sat down. And then all of a sudden, nothing happened. And even though we briefed Colin Powell and Condi Rice about this.
Right, this is on the transition. So Albert Gore does not become president of the United States. George W. Bush does. He brings in Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell to talk with Wendy and I think Bob Einhorn at the time, the team, to brief them, do the handoff, because you had gotten pretty far. You were pretty close to an agreement to make sure there were no nuclear tests. There hadn't been nuclear tests yet, and that ballistic missile testing ended.
Absolutely. So what happens is, and I know that General Powell was very interested in it. So he was, all of a sudden there's a headline in the Washington Post saying, Powell to continue Clinton policies on North Korea. He's hauled into the Oval and told no way. So while
I've written about this, and he said 3 things you should never say: North Korea negotiations and Clinton.
Exactly. And I think that part of it was I hold no brief for the North Koreans, but we're the ones that cut that off.
Yeah.
And there have been...
the United States.
We, the United States. And I think, by the way, the only thing we did know, really know about Kim Jong-il was that he loved basketball. So I take full responsibility for Dennis Rodman because what we did was to bring over a basketball autographed by Michael Jordan. And it's in their Holy of Holies. So that was the one piece of...
That's diplomacy.
Useful.
Dennis Rodman is farce, but okay.
But I do think that it has gotten much worse. I know that the Bush administration, and the Obama administration really tried to do something in various negotiations. And it never kind of gets sealed. The main problem in many ways is we... don't have a peace treaty to the Korean War, and nor do we really have we have no official relationships with North Korea, and yet we put them on the terrorist list in a variety of ways, and we have not really any good contact. So and then I don't know. I'm sure been to the demilitarized zone.
I have not.
You have not. It is the weirdest place you ever could go. It is on the 38th parallel, the dividing line. There is a North Korean side with huge buildings that you kind of wonder whether they actually have any backs to them or whether they're just facades. There are loudspeakers.
Is there a Korean word for Potemkin?
That's something like that. Then some totally little artificial village somewhere. And then on the South Korean side, it looks like a normal base. And then in between, there are kind of Quonset huts. And in one of them, there's a table with a string across the middle, which is where the 38th parallel is. And by the way, I took my former foreign ministers there several years ago to look at that. It's such a one step forward and two steps back, that said they would close one of their areas, Yangbyong. They've now said it I don't know how many times, and is constantly still operating. And
they want some sanctions relief for doing that, and we've been insisting that they do shut down the entire nuclear complex, and then we'll discuss sanctions relief. So that's going nowhere. You were moving on a step-by-step basis, which I think
but I don't underestimate the difficulty of all of this, because they are hard to deal with. I think that one of the difficult parts about diplomacy is who goes first. So what you try to do is have things happen simultaneously. And whether there always this question, are there conditions, are there no conditions? I think that I wish them well, because very, very complicated. Steve Biegun is either going to take over as Secretary of State or go to North Korea or whatever. Everything is a little bit up in the air.
But he's our best hope. Very competent.
Very competent, yeah.
Good. Okay. I don't want to let you go without telling you how much our board enjoyed our discussion with you. And a number of our board members said that they have been living with you in their ears for the last couple of weeks because they've been listening to your audio book. And that was Fascism, A Warning.
Right.
So that's the audio book, and they were thrilled to meet you. And I was going to ask you to say a few words about that, but you just told me you have a new book coming out.
I do, yes.
So the last one was Fascism, A Warning. What's this one?
This one is called Hell and Other Destinations. And what it is...
You are really on a cheery little tear here, aren't you?
But the book is actually quite cheery, because what it is, it tries to describe the things that I've been involved in since I left office. And it's based on the fact that one has many opportunities of doing something after one is in office and try to figure out how they all fit together. I teach, continue to do that. I'm chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute. I'm on the Aspen board. I'm head of the Truman Foundation for Scholars. And I have a global consulting firm. And in my own head, I can rationalize that they all go together. And they do, because one thing informs another. And it pushes me to think in many ways. We didn't talk about artificial intelligence and cyber and various new things that I have to, understand, but also get into my syllabus and start teaching my students. Something in many ways quite different when you were a student in the 80s, where we had rules about arms control.
Yes.
We recognized that we were living in a dangerous world. It was and many of our policies were based on that. The world was divided into red, white, and blue. It was dangerous, but there were certain ways of operating. And at the moment, we have non-state actors that are involved, countries that don't know which direction they're going, America leadership lacking. And so I say the world's a mess. That's a diplomatic term of art.
It certainly is. And the guardrails are off, not just in the White House or the other capitals of the world, but also in our international system. It's a dangerous time. Secretary Albright, thank you very much for helping to guide us at this moment. It was a real honor talking with you this morning.
Joe, and thank you for what you're doing and what you've been doing, because you are really steeped in these various issues and can explain the various arms control agreements and where we're going in a very cogent way. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. We all do our best. A real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.